Welcome to the Research Culture Uncovered podcast, where in every episode we explore what is research culture and what should it be. You'll hear thoughts and opinions from a range of contributors to help you change research culture into what you want it to be.
Hi, it's Nick, and this episode of Research Culture Uncovered is a little different, not to mention a little longer than usual. It's a recording from one of our open lunch webinars, which are a monthly series of online talks that cover all sorts of topics related to open research and open education, open practice in general, really. Everyone is welcome, and you can find an archive of recordings on the library blog, which I've linked in the show notes below. There's a panel discussion about podcasting. Rather than publishing this one as a video, as I usually do, I thought we should make it into, well, a podcast. The webinar was chaired by Andy Tattersall from the University of Sheffield, and who I'll pass straight over to now to introduce himself and our panel of podcasters.
So just a brief introduction of who I am. I work in the Sheffield Centre for Health and Related Research. I've got a long sort of connection with audio as such. I started making radio shows for friends when I was about 14 years old on cassette, and was a pirate radio DJ for about 6 years in the 1990s, and did a journalism degree in the 1990s as broadcast journalism, and eventually took the plunge into bringing this kind of stuff into my work around 6-7 years ago in my own podcasts, and now produce and host my own podcast called Communicable Research. I'll put a link into all of these, and I produce a podcast called Research Records, which is a cross between Desert Island Discs and the Life Scientific, and it's quite apt that we've had Jim Al-Khalili as a guest on there, and also Helen Sharman. So, and I produce other podcasts as well, and host a podcast course, an online podcast course. But I'm really pleased to be chairing a quartet of experts who are making podcasts at University of Leeds and elsewhere, that are doing some really interesting stuff in the sphere of research dissemination, sharing ideas, good practice and professionalism. And I was listening this morning to an episode of Research Adjacent as I was actually coming in. So what I would like is our four panellists to actually tell us who they are and the podcast that they do for a minute or so. But I also want to encourage you all to start thinking about questions and putting them in the chat. I've got some questions lined up, but really, ideally, I want to hear from you, and we want to hear from you about any questions. And there is no stupid question about making podcasts. If you feel like, oh, this is a dumb question, I shouldn't be asking it, I'm sure there'll be plenty of people who will probably have the same question. So don't be shy. It's a really good space, and we've got some real expertise here to share with you. So I'm going to go around. I'll start with Jana first to talk about her work.
Hi, everyone. A warm welcome, and thank you for having me on this episode, Andy and Nick and the rest. So what I do, so my name is Jana. I'm an academic who keeps popping in and out of the policy world, and someone who kind of likes to travel lightly across the world. So currently based in Leeds, and what we did, Hannah and I, in the podcast that we hosted last year, titled Business of Policymaking, was thinking how to bring the policy world closer to academia. And as you know, academia in the UK, also the Netherlands, but also Slovenia, I know we have guests today from Slovenia, is becoming increasingly invested in making research socially relevant and socially responsible. But how to do that? It's not always easy. We don't know how to speak to the policy world, how to speak to policy wonks, and so on and so forth. So our question here was, how can research inform better public policy that is based on evidence? Obviously, that's a perpetual question. But how better to learn about this than to speak to those who actually do policy, who work in the policy world across the world. Hannah and I had this kind of intense conversation on how to do that is both eco-friendly and also, friendly to human beings, so that we don't have to fly them from all over the world, but still enjoy learning from them. And so, obviously, the most obvious kind of medium for that was the podcast. So we managed to kind of bring all these manic schedules, manic locations into series called The Business of Policymaking. And I'll develop this further as we go. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you. And over to you, Hannah, please.
Hi, I'm Hannah Preston. I'm Leeds University Business School's Research Communications Manager. So my job is all about making our research accessible and getting it out to a wider audience. So as part of this, I created the Business School's Research and Innovation podcast. And it's another way of helping to get our researchers' work to different audiences, to non-academic audiences, work that was traditionally stuck behind a paywalled journal article, helping to share it in different formats. And the episodes are really varied. We've got such different topics, although you might just think business school about business. It's actually massively varied. So some episodes might be on rural entrepreneurship and difficulties that farmers are facing, whereas others are about working in childcare, some about how we can do just transitions to greener working environments. So although the topics are really varied, the main theme is that it's all research that's taking place within the business school, or it's all expert opinion from our thought leaders on something topical. So we're slightly different, our podcast, in that we're not we don't regularly put episodes out as much as I'd like to be able to say we do it fortnightly. I kind of took the pressure off and said we'll share something when someone's got something to share. So I very much encourage our colleagues to use the podcast for their own projects as well. So if they're on a 3-year funded project, I say, well, why don't we aim for a 6-episode playlist, and I create a specific playlist for them, and then they've got our platform, my support. They don't have to worry about keeping on top of things and sharing it, and they can utilize the audience that we already have with the Business Schools podcast.
Thank you, Hannah. And over to you, Sarah.
Hi, thanks very much for inviting me to come along. So yeah, I'm Sarah McCluskey, and I am not at Leeds actually, but Leeds have been incredibly welcoming, inviting me to come along today. I host the Research Adjacent podcast, and that is a podcast which shares stories and strategies to help people to navigate a research adjacent career. By research adjacent, if you don't know the term, I didn't quite make it up, but I've definitely run with it. It is all the people who are part of the research environment but are not academics. So I've had all kinds of guests on the podcast, including Nick and Ged, who are on the call today, both being guests. Talk about all kinds of different jobs and things like that, and some episodes which are about some of the common challenges that people in the research adjacent world face. This is not my first podcast, so I am a freelance research communication specialist. But my first podcast was actually one for a research project that I worked on called Life of Breath. And it came out of as a research communication specialist, I've always said that you should consume the content that you want to create. And at the time I was listening to lots of podcasts. So I was like, well, why don't we make a podcast? And some of the things that we had in the research project really lent themselves. There was a lot to do with music and audio content and things like that. So that was my first podcast. And I just earlier this year also helped to create another podcast called Academic Adventures, which is about academic entrepreneurship for the University of the West of Scotland. And that was supported by Scottish Enterprise. So a few different toes in this research podcasting water.
Thank you, Sarah. And finally, over to Ged.
All right, thanks, Andy, and hi, everyone. So I'm Ged Hall here at Leeds, and I'm one of the co-hosts, and we have a number of the other hosts on the call. So if I say anything wrong, I'm sure Ruth will jump in and kind of correct me. But we're as I said, multi-host. Research Culture Uncovered covers all aspects of research culture. It's interesting what Sarah said in terms of consume the content you want to have, because I hated podcasts before before becoming a host. I tried listening to some in my space. I'm a research impact professional, but Mark will probably be not surprised by this feedback, that I always felt that he went on a bit too long. So Mark Reed in his Fast Track Impacts podcast. So I kind of didn't engage with that. So that was interesting. But the point of our podcast is that we try to showcase a lot of activity around research culture. So, and we take all sorts of different viewpoints. And we have different themes. So Nick is one of the co-hosts. So obviously his is around open research. Mine's around research impact. Ruth is a careers expert. So hers is around research careers. We've got Emma on the call. So she does stuff around kind of research culture more generally and sort of leadership. Tony Bromley is also one of the hosts, and he does things around kind of talent management and kind of the earlier career research environment. And we're encouraging new hosts. So Taryn joined us a few months ago. We've now just hit our second anniversary, just about to. So Taryn Bell joined us, and she also does things around careers. And Emily will be joining us, and I think she'll be doing things around kind of responsible research, which kind of overlaps to some extent with my kind of research impact things. So thanks, Sandy.
Thank you. And it's nice to see there's a plus one. There's a nice commendation here from Izzy. So she's listened to some episodes of Research Culture Uncovered podcast, learnt loads. So a thumbs up there, a nice endorsement. So a question for you all in terms of this ever-changing research environment we find ourselves in, and ways to try and disseminate research, to try and generate impact, to reach policymakers, even reach the public. What is it that podcasts bring that perhaps some of the other methods that we've been using a little bit longer, perhaps in academia, such as social media, traditional media, blogs? What is it that podcasts bring to the party that we didn't maybe have a few years ago? And maybe start with Hannah. Hannah.
Yeah, I think I definitely don't put podcasts above any of the platforms. I think they're a mix. I think because people prefer to receive information in different ways. So if you prefer to watch things, podcasts might not be great. If you, like me, prefer to read things, that's going to be a preference. So I think it's about offering a variety. But one thing I do think works really well with podcasts is bringing across personality, making them more engaging, actually being able to literally hear the voice of the person who's sharing these insights. I think it's the quickest and easiest way to get that personality there. And particularly when we're sharing academic research, sometimes, particularly when you think of journal articles, it can be very dry and you lose any sense of passion. Whereas actually people who are dedicated, most of their lives to, this, they care about what you have to care about what you're working on, to be this involved, and I think to be an academic, and people are keen to share their insights. And I think that sometimes doesn't come across. But when you've got podcasts, particularly when you're being interviewed or you're in a conversation with a colleague, you can bring across that passion, and you also get a chance to share the anecdotes as well, the things that don't go into the formal findings but are still important to you, or still important to share as well.
Thank you. Great points. Anyone like to contribute to that?
Yeah, I feel offended as an academic,
Yeah.
Hannah, saying we are dry. No, but I agree. It's also the language. You have so much more freedom to express very complex ideas when you just talk. But I just wanted to interfere as an academic. It's I think what we really like, because I think the podcast that Hannah and I did, The Business of Policymaking, kind of stands out from the rest of the podcasts here, is kind of bringing the external world, which is very often so remote from what we do in academia, is I think it brings that extra value, and I think this is what podcasts can do, kind of bring different worlds to us into academia. But one thing that I thought was an advantage of doing a podcast was the kind of host to listener interaction, and this is something we didn't do quite well in our podcast, because this is not how it was set up initially. But that's something that I think is an added value of a podcast. I think Sarah was trying to raise before I protested. Sarah, over to you.
You're muted, Sarah.
Oh, there we go. Sorry, too many mute buttons. That's my problem. You would think I knew what I was doing by now. I was just going to add, I mean, I think as Hannah and Jana have said, the way you get across the personality and the relationship, I think, is really important, and there's an intimacy about it, which I think builds bridges incredibly quickly between the listener and the person who's talking in the podcast, much more than any other form of relationship. I think even than face to face, I think you build intimacy much quicker, and I think that is really valuable. And then I also think there is the fact that it's pretty much the only way of consuming this information when you're not sitting at a desk. So I think so many people listen to podcasts when they are, like, I've just been out walking the dog and listening to podcasts while I was walking the dog. You know, they might be tidying the house, they might be cooking, you know, whatever. And there's so much information out there in the world that giving people that option to consume it in a way that fits in with their life, I think, is really valuable.
Yeah, I think everybody's kind of not stolen my points, because we're all not competitive here in in terms of the research culture. But I think just to add on to that, I think there's a range of views you can have. You know, in terms of we're a panel at the moment, we can disagree with each other. I mean, in doing that, we can expand the range of views, and actually we can debate. So you can get debate happening on podcasts, which is less likely, I think, with other things. I mean, and also debate can be a bit more confrontational in some of the other mechanisms. So I think that's the thing I would add.
Thank you, Jen. I think that's interesting about the idea of debate as well, something that perhaps we do overlook, and having multiple voices. This is quite an apt question that's coming from someone, because I was down at, say, Sheffield Hallam talking about open educational resources and the sort of the issues relating to that. And this is very similar. And someone's asked, how does the university administration, i.e. such as legal department, I'm thinking probably issues around reputation management, view podcasts? Do they scrutinize them beforehand, or are you free to broadcast anything you want? Would they be under review, whatever that might involve, or are they largely autonomous to talk about what we choose to talk about? And I think this goes back to an earlier point about academic freedom, etc. Has anyone got a particular thoughts on those? Yeah, Jana. So Jana, put up. So yeah, Jana.
Thanks. No, I think it's a really, really good question, particularly now in this really highly politicized period, where I think there is a very contested issue between academic freedom, as well as some self-censorship that also academics and others do. And I think our podcast was particularly slippery slope, because we hosted people from, you know, the world of politics, not just policy making. And you never know, as an academic, perhaps, what could trigger, what could be the wrong thing. And we did have a good example of that. Perhaps Hannah can highlight that a bit on later on. We hosted an expert from one of the governmental offices, and obviously the opponents of that particular political area really contested what was said in a podcast. So there was some kind of a, potential reputation issue there, which I think was handled really, really well. But to answer that specific question, we kind of had some internal checks before it was aired. But in this particular podcast, I think it was really more important to have it checked by those who came onto the podcast, because it turned out it was far more a slippery slope for them than it was for us. Because when they have an open conversation with an academic, they tend to open up more than they probably would if they were not exposed to that kind of imagined freedom. Hannah, would you like to add anything?
It was a mixed reactions day, because I saw that the podcast had been mentioned in it was the Scottish Daily Mail. I thought, first reaction, oh, podcast got a mention. And I was like, oh, Daily Mail, what's happening here? So that was unexpected. Some things like you say, you can kind of expect might happen. You can do a bit of a risk analysis, but some things come out of the blue. It was fine. The speaker was fine with it. We didn't get anything further, but that was just a bit of an insight into even with those internal checks. Yeah, so I think there are 2 points here. So there's one that Jana's raised with the internal checks and making sure your speakers are happy, because that's the main thing, making sure that what they've said they're all right with. And for the policymaking podcast that we had a peer group with similar interests who we checked in from. But as my position as a communications manager in the university, I think my official advice would be to check in with your marketing teams. I don't know how other people have done it here, and I'm cautious of saying anything that might get us into trouble, because I'm very much of the, hey, let's just roll with it. Let's do it. And if it's wrong, they'll tell us later. But I think my official bottom line is please check in with your marketing teams, because there are things. So the literal answer, sorry, to your question is no one's going to be checking. There isn't someone in Central who says we need to listen to every episode before it goes out. However, if you are going out there saying you are a University of Leeds podcast, if you're wanting to use the branding and the artwork, there will be certain checks you need to do. So I would encourage anyone who's considering doing it to go off and say, just speak to your marketing team or the central communications team. I mean, it's a bit like with social media pages, there's never an exact clear line of people who have academic social media pages, and then they say, work at the University of Leeds, views are my own. And you think, yes, absolutely, freedom of speech. But at the same time, if you're talking about what you do at work and, some of your opinions are perhaps questionable, or they're bringing in line the institution's reputation, then, there's a conversation to be had there.
Sorry, Ged, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I think in terms of that, it's probably wise. We didn't do that. So, and 2 years in, nobody's come back to us. We do know that, people further up do listen, but from an interest point of view, which is great. That's not from a censorship point of view. The other thing to kind of bear in mind is that our central comms team also got involved in podcasting over the last year with a podcast called How to Fix. So that was kind of really publicizing some different areas of research. So there was one that I spotted, which had a old undergraduate mates of mine doing stuff around quality and things like that. And so I think if your central comms team is involved in it and kind of really thinking that this is a great thing to do, I kind of really don't think that there's too much. I mean, we do think through what is our angle. As Hannah said, we mention this with our guests, whether they're internal or external to the university. We make sure they're happy with how it's edited and all of those things, and the show notes replicate the points that they've made and any links that they want to do. So all of that gets kind of internally peer reviewed, if you will, with the guest.
Sarah, do you want to add anything regarding that?
I think, well, not especially because I'm in a slightly different situation where I'm freelance, so I can put out whatever I like, which in some ways makes it a lot easier. But obviously, when I have guests on, they may feel that they're representing their organization. So sometimes when I have guests on, they sort of say, oh, I need to just go and check with my comms department that it's okay for me to do this, and then I'll be able to kind of confirm. And I always do give people, I don't let people listen to it beforehand, partly just because of the logistics of if they come back and say they want things edited, it can be a bit of a headache. But I will let them have the transcript after the call, so that if they say, can we take this out? The same goes in the conversation. If they say something and they say, oh, that came out wrong, can we re-record it? Then I'm absolutely happy to do that. But yeah, actually, as far as I'm concerned, once it's out in the world, it's out in the world. So yeah, but I don't just talk about anything very controversial.
Really sort of like following on from this and this kind of this question, two things here. One about momentum. How do you maintain momentum? Sarah, how do you keep sourcing guests and producing, and Hannah, how do you do the same, and how do you have that momentum? But also from terms of the institutional perspective, the issues where you may be doing more thorny, contentious issues, and that you do feel a little bit edgy and nervy, that in itself could breed some kind of inertia that actually making the podcast becomes a bit of a pain, because you're actually treating these particular areas and have to be very cautious. So two things here, and I'll ask Sarah first in terms of the process of momentum, just keeping a series going.
Yeah, sure. So it is really hard. Yeah, one thing I will say. So Research Adjacent has been going for over 18 months now. And that I initially started doing it every week. And after about 15 episodes, I decided to drop down to doing it once a fortnight, just to make it a little bit more manageable. But otherwise, from that point of view, I just always am thinking, I'm always having to work a few episodes ahead. Who do I want to talk to? Looking at the balance of the program. I mean, partly I love it. So, and I find it, for me, I just love talking to people and finding I'm really curious, and I love finding out about them and what they do. So the actually doing the interviews and things like that, for me, that's the really fun bit. Sometimes doing all the editing and stuff afterwards can be a bit of a chore. But I would say, yeah, if you're worried about momentum, don't get into it unless you've got a sense of, like, there's this whole thing of pod fade where people do like 3 episodes and then it's never heard of again. I was told that before I started. So I initially went in with 10 recorded. So I didn't put any out until I had 10 ready to go. I think that's a really valuable piece of advice. It's fine to do things in seasons. So it's fine to say, I'm going to do 10 episodes. The Life of Breath podcast, as I mentioned, the first one I did, that actually we only ever did 10 episodes. And that was, all we ever intended to do was 10 episodes. It was within the scope of the research project, and that was fine. So maybe it's about being clear about your goals for it, whether you want it to keep going or whether you want it to be a limited time thing. But have a plan, I would say. Don't just record a couple of episodes just to see.
And colleagues at Leeds, because one of the problems is often you have this great energy to get these things going, and you've got to try and get colleagues to buy in. So again, is that an issue as well in terms of momentum?
So I think we're finding that we've got way more content than we can probably deal with at the moment. We've got we have a LinkedIn presence for our podcast, and we put it out there in terms of who wants to be a guest. It's kind of open access. So we're currently kind of going down that list, kind of meeting those people, having a quick chat, and kind of going, what might be your angle for that episode? And then there's kind of like, oh yeah, that does make sense. That does fit with our aim, and what we're hoping for from our podcast. So I think that crowdsourcing has been useful in terms of generating us momentum. I mean, I remember in our early days, we did the let's do it weekly and then went to fortnightly. And I remember we also did seasons, when we started off, we did seasons that, when did I put my hand up? I didn't actually touch my keyboard, so I didn't actually put my hand up. It's just Zoom thinking I'm talking, I'm guessing. So when we did the series initially, we did series, so each of us would do 8-9 episodes, and that was tough, especially because that's when we were doing the weekly release, and I kind of thankfully followed Sarah's advice even without knowing it, and kind of tried to get almost all my episodes in the can. But one of the hosts who I won't name and shame kind of was a bit more last minute and felt quite pressured by that. So I think it's kind of like, work out what's your method of, are you happy with that kind of just in time delivery? And if you're not, don't do it.
Anyone else? Jana, Hannah, want to contribute?
Yeah, so I'll leave Jana to talk about the business policy making one, because they're two very different ones, in that was a set series with a number of episodes, whereas the research and innovation one is a rolling one. And again, I don't know whether we were weekly, but certainly fortnightly, and now it's not. I couldn't even tell you it was monthly. It's sometimes we might have 3 in a month, sometimes it's 1 in 3 months. But I think it's, again, knowing the purpose. So if, for example, you're wanting to do it on a particular project and you think, well, actually, there are so many different things we could talk about. Why don't we say, let's do 6 episodes and just release it as a series? You don't have to have this pressure to be ongoing. You can think, we've got we've got 6 experts involved in this, different stakeholders. Why not feature all of them as a guest? And you don't have to set yourself up for this ongoing process. The way we do it with the business school is, like I said, I'll share it in the chat now. But we use it for projects. And again, people don't have to have the pressure of doing it at a certain time. But the downside of this is, and I'm sure we're going to go into this, it's really hard to build up a regular listenership. So if you know that you're going to release something every week, people can tune in. They can go, oh, it's Tuesday morning, I'm going to be listening to this. And that's probably the better way to growing. Whereas we might not have great listening figures for that, but we know we're going to reach a target audience. So for example, if people are using the podcast for a project, they might say, oh, we're really trying to get on with this certain department somewhere, and we can send it directly to them. And that's more valuable for that person. So for us, not having this regular element isn't as important. So if you're trying to perhaps grow yourself as a brand or a reputation, you want to see yourself as experts, then yes, you want to be thinking about your frequency and getting your fortnightly, weekly episodes out there. But if you're using it as a way of disseminating particular information and trying to reach a specific audience, then you don't necessarily have to put that pressure on yourself to be doing these regular episodes. If that makes sense.
Jana, do you want to add?
Yeah, that's such a good point, because in our podcast, again, kind of it stands out from the others presented today, was that we had some really big shots coming onto our show, and managing the incredibly busy schedules of those big figures who work in different time zones and so on and so forth. Was there was a lot of work, and this is something I think very often ignored or overlooked by some zealous, enthusiastic podcasters or people who are thinking about doing a podcast, is that there's like 10 times more time that needs to go into doing a podcast than we anticipated. And I think Hannah and I spent about a year before actually releasing the podcast series. And there was always a plan of having kind of them organized in series, as both Ged and Sarah already mentioned, because we just didn't know how many people we would be able to secure, what the timing would be. But one thing that I've learned from other podcasts, and also as a podcast listener, is that what I appreciate is a consistent release schedule. Doesn't matter the frequency, but it has to be consistent. And I think Sarah has already mentioned, it's even if you decide to have it just once a month, just make sure that you actually do put it out once a month, because the competition is fierce, and I'm quite sure your podcast isn't as jazzy, as sexy as we, who kind of put our sweat and tears into making it actually, believe. And so make sure you are there, you're out there, and if you're serious about it, just be consistent in putting it out there.
So a similar sort of following on question from Catherine, which I think obviously you all give some thought about and have alluded to in your previous answers, but how do you advertise and situate your podcast so that they can be sure people will tune in, or at least give them as good a chance? Because it's an increasingly crowded area, not just that, it's all the other means of dissemination. So how do you actually tackle that? I don't know who wants to go first. Ged? Yeah.
So one point that I was just going to follow on from Jana, which actually situates with your next question, Andy, is that we've tried to avoid being competitive. So Sarah's podcast could be seen as competitive to ours in terms of the research careers bit, but we've had Sarah on our podcast, and as she said, I and Nick have been on hers. So we are kind of doing promotion for each other. We've also done that with another podcast called Research Co Culture, which was organised by they were, when they started the podcast, postdocs at Oxford. Now one of them works in the Government Office for Science, and another one works for a pharma company, but they're carrying on with that podcast. So again, we did that co-promotion, if you will. The other thing we've done heavily, we're really consistent in terms of where we tell. I know Sarah's kind of dropped off Twitter. We've carried on, mainly because we've still got people kind of picking it up from that direction. And it's also really important that you know, when you have a guest, that they utilize their networks. So if the guest is really passive in advertising their own episode, then you do kind of notice that in the listening figures. But if they're really active in promoting their own episode into their own networks, however they do it, you know, you do notice a real big uptick for that kind of guest.
Yeah, that could be quite infuriating when you've had a guest on who's got quite a lot of followers and you tweet at them and then they just like it at best. And you sort of kind of go, oh, no,
yeah,
that was an opportunity lost. Anyone else want to contribute in terms of follow that up?
Yeah, I can say a little bit about, I mean, it's in terms of sharing it, promoting it, it's just all the same stuff you would do with anything. You know, it's social media, it's email newsletters, you know, it's all that kind of stuff. As Jed says, I don't use Twitter anymore, but you know, LinkedIn is really growing now that Twitter has fallen away. In the podcast apps themselves, people sometimes search. So for example, in Spotify in particular, people can search for topics and things and find podcasts that way. I don't know Apple Podcasts well because I don't have an Apple device. And then, as Jed says as well, this if you've got a podcast that interviews people, then that's amazing for increasing the reach, provided that they share it with their networks, being guests on other people's podcasts. I've been guest on quite a few different related podcasts, talking about it at events, conferences, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, all of that usual kind of thing.
Anyone else?
I had Hannah, you know, whose brain is kind of like always around how do we make the best of what we produce, and kind of Hannah had a strategy. I'm so far from strategizing, kind of making plans and all that. So I think one of the really added value here was that we worked in tandem, kind of like we paired up, and we brought to that podcast a completely different perspectives, completely different experiences. So it wasn't just adding up and stacking up the same kind of skills and same knowledge. It was really completely different kind of components. And I think it really, really, really worked. In terms of promotion, as an academic, you know, like how you get an email invite to an event 2 weeks before the event, and 2 weeks before the event, you get another 100 invites to another 100 events. So I think being in people's faces all the time, not all the time, kind of striking the really fine balance between being there all the time and kind of not being there, is you don't underestimate not so much competition as for the content, but the competition for attention and time that people are able to invest into what you produce. So I think good reminders. This is something we slightly failed to do. Kind of like we launched it, we put it out there, and then thought, oh, people will pick it up. But no, you have to kind of keep repeating, kind of putting it back out there. So I think that's a very good strategy. If you're serious about that, just kind of don't shy away from promoting it in regular intervals as well.
Just sort of following on, because I know some of my panel do this, how important are trailers and clips, things on social media, things that kind of hook people in with a 30-second clip? How do you use those in any particular way?
I just said, to be honest, we don't, but I'd like to. But it's another example of things taking time. Like, look, you know, with the business of policymaking, you know, it was very much Jana leading on the content, and we were both doing it. But with the R&I podcast, it's just me, and it's part of my only work 70% part-time anyway, and the podcast is one of another 95 things I'm expected to do each week. So I'm not expected to do, I want to do, I love it. They're all these things are my passion projects that end up being kind of an integral part of the strategy because I make them that way. But there is so much more we could do with it. There's so much more I'd like to do. I'd like to do more trailers. I'd like to do more detailed show notes. I'd like to think more about the SEO. I'd like to do more visuals. I'd like to make sure we've got great speaker headshots as well as having our own kind of podcast visual identity, which we use. I'd like to make sure we've got more teasers in the run-up. I'd like to do series summaries. So I do think they're important. Basically, I don't want anyone to go look at the R&I podcast and think, oh, she's not doing any of those things there. So I think but it's an important, this panel is to share experiences. An important part of that is, I'm sure we'll discuss this, is how much time does it take? Well, the recording part, you can be done within an hour. Recording the podcast is not the thing that takes time. It's editing. I know a couple of people say they don't do much editing with the podcasts. I do a lot of editing on ours, and that's because some of our academics aren't very comfortable speaking on the podcast. For most of them, it's the first time they've done it. A lot of them perhaps haven't spoken at events yet, and they're quite nervous. And as part of that reassurance, I say, look, don't worry. If you want to say something 5 times, we'll do that. A lot of people have the ums and ahs in there, which again, I don't delete all of, but I do go through that a bit. So editing takes me a lot of time. Again, going back to an earlier point about checking people are happy with it, some of the research we talk about is externally funded. So they've got to have that cap on and think, actually, would my funders be happy with me saying that? So there's time taken to do that, checking the transcript, everything else, uploading it, coming up with the social media things to share. So not trying to put anyone off doing this, absolutely not, but just as an awareness of, yes, start thinking about a social media strategy. Teasers will help, trailers will help, but factor in time. You think it's only going to take you 5 minutes to draft something for LinkedIn, but when you've actually gone, oh, I need to find the profile to link the right person. I need to see which hashtags are the popular ones at the moment. Let me just double check the spelling of that. Oh, the picture's not pulling through for some reason. A 5-minute job's taken 40 minutes, and those kind of things can add up.
Can I jump in, Andy? Just Hannah and I had, months-long conversation around a vodcast versus a podcast. Kind of like, do we do video with the podcast? And it would be so good if I could hear your thoughts on that as well, because as someone who's losing hearing, as someone who's losing eyesight, kind of like I prefer having it all, having everyone in my screen and just shouting out, both visually and using sound as well. And as a listener, kind of like I prefer those with videos, although that goes against your point, Sarah. I think people, kind of listening everywhere, anywhere, at all times, whereas videocast doesn't have that. But Hannah and I decided against it, also because, it does require a very experienced guest as well as a host. And, some would come in onto a show wearing just, plain t-shirts. And for a big shot who is supposed to be wearing a tie and whatever, attire and uniform, I think that felt far more relaxing than it would with a camera. But I wonder what you think about the future of podcast in that respect.
Thank you, Jana. Anyone want to contribute? It sounds like, Hannah, though, it sounds like you need a job doing the podcast at University of Leeds, or someone needs to clone you.
That'd be nice. That'd be good. Yeah.
Anyone want to add in terms of that?
Well, yeah, I don't do videos. Actually, I think this was one of the questions we thought we might talk about, and we haven't. I don't do videos for the reason it puts people off being a guest. Actually, is one of the reasons I don't, because there's a lot of people who kind of don't mind the audio, but actually they're less keen to be on video, at least for them to be on video like the whole time through an entire podcast. And it happened to me once recently. I was a guest on a podcast and they didn't warn me that they were going to use the video. And suddenly I went on social media and there was my face, and because I hadn't known they were going to record it, I hadn't been making sure I was looking at the camera, all that sort of stuff. So to be honest, doing just the audio is a pretty big job in itself. If you then add video in as well, it starts to become more difficult for somebody to do it as a side gig, if you know what I mean. Like if they're not a professional videographer or podcast maker, when you start to add in all those extra things, you're adding extra complexity. So if somebody just wants to, sometimes we give ourselves all kinds of reasons not to get started. And if video is something that's holding people back from getting started, just forget about it.
Yeah, I think just coming in on that, we got some training from a podcast coach, lovely guy from the States, so he was logging in to help with the training at about 4:00 in the morning for him and things like that. And one thing he said to us was, in terms of that, Ruth's just put the point in terms of authenticity, is trying to have it as almost like you're listening in on a really interesting conversation in the coffee shop or the pub or something like that. So anything you do that makes it less easy for the guest to be in that relaxed state, like they're just having a really interesting conversation with a with a colleague, maybe soon to be a friend, in a relaxed environment, avoid doing that, because ultimately people can get blown off course. And we've certainly had to work with guests, even on the audio side of things, in terms of getting over their kind of things like imposter syndrome, things like, do I sound stupid? You kind of go, you're talking to a person from Blackburn, I've got an accent, and I'm not going to hide it, because I went through that pain as an undergraduate at university in London in the 80s, and I'm not doing it again as a 56-year-old. So, let's just be honest. This is our voices, and let's just have a really interesting conversation and allow others to hear it.
Just building on that.
Go on, sorry, Hannah.
I was just building on that. Something that we've kind of talked about without explicitly mentioning is to factor in who your host is going to be. So I'm the odd one out on the podcast here, and I'm the only one who's not a host, and there's a reason for that. Apart from getting, I was going to say roped in, but I wasn't roped into this at all. I was delighted to be invited to be on this panel, but I'm very much normally behind the scenes. I always say it's ironic that for someone who works in communications, I struggle to communicate things when it's not coming from my own mouth. But I don't host on the R&I podcast. I ensure that it's between two academics, or an academic and someone involved in the project, or one of our postgraduate researchers, or someone else. But if you are going to be a host, you've got to allow some more time. I think everyone here does a fantastic job of that. But it is a skill set. You've got to be confident, you've got to be comfortable, you've got to make your guests comfortable. But you also have to allow a bit of time to do the research. You can't invite, and I'll let others speak about this, but you can't just invite someone on and then expect them kind of do the heavy lifting. You kind of need to know what they're about and what questions. So I think if you are, for people on this webinar who are thinking about doing their own podcast, I think thinking about who is going to be the literal voice of your series, and I'm sure the Research Culture Uncovered team would probably want to talk about their roles of being team players rather than just one person. So that's different with Sarah's podcast, the kind of pros and cons of that. But I think it's just worth highlighting that the role of the host is a really important one.
Jana, did you put your hand up?
Yeah, I think this is such a great point, because obviously, like if you have an idea to do a podcast, then have a think if you actually have, if you have the skill to be a host and be hosting it as well. And my advice would be to really know the content, and especially if you're doing kind of like what we did in ours was talking to people. And even though it's very useful to have a rough plan, and a lot of people would want to have questions in advance, it should be a conversation. So it's not kind of like an undergraduate interview where you get straight questions and you don't expand. The good podcast expands on that, and for that, obviously, you need to be knowledgeable. You need to know things. So it's not just the research; it's also you feeling comfortable about having those sometimes really tough conversations and kind of being on a journey with your guest.
Thank you. And just to say, Ged, you've got a great voice for podcasts. The Blackburn accent's very nice. It sounds very much like Graham Massey from 808 States, a nice accent.
Yeah. A colleague of mine said, face for radio.
I think I've got that. A quick question here to go around you, because I know we haven't got a lot of time and there's questions coming in. So it's just really a quick one. What's the one thing you wish you'd known before you started your podcast journey? Who would like to start with that? Maybe Sarah, yourself running your own podcast, etc.
Oh, goodness me. I think if the one thing, I can think of lots of things. And my mind's just got to come back to me. My mind's just gone slightly blank because I just answered a question in the chat and my mind was still on that. So come back to me.
Okay. So who would like to pick up? Ged?
So I think I think the thing that was really interesting for us, that because we had some coaching, we didn't we kind of taught through all of those things. So there was nothing that was kind of a surprise, but there was how do you control multiple people when you're on a situation like this when you've got the panel, and you're doing a fantastic job of handling us, because we are all quite chatty. I know the five of us four of us are quite chatty, so talking over each other and that being difficult when it comes to editing and things like that. So it's that when you go past more than just you and the guest is the one that's always been challenging, and then keeping that short enough. We have an aim to try and hit sort of 20 to 30 minutes as a rough guide for our episodes, and I had 2 guests on the podcast that's going out next week, and I was fully interested in it, and we've hit 70 minutes. So if you're a subscriber to ours, make sure you set some time aside for that coming out next week.
Jana.
Yeah, just wanted to say that I'm a professional guest on podcasts, but definitely not a professional host. And as a newcomer to being a host on a very short-lived podcast, I completely underestimated the amount of effort, energy, and time that goes into producing a good quality show. Everything from identifying a perfect guest, identifying a pitch idea. Really, please don't underestimate it. There's so much time that goes into that, and I wasn't even kind of like doing the post-production because the technical part was left to Hannah. So kind of like I did my, I was the front woman of that podcast. But there's a lot of energy that goes into preparing your guests, getting them ready, and not all of them are experienced guests, so don't underestimate that. But they may have, like a really true kind of valuable information to share, and you really want to bring them on a podcast. But for a podcast, it needs to be, it needs to have an energy, it needs to breathe, it needs to kind of have the vibe. So have that conversation with your potential guest ahead of time. See how they respond, see how stiff they are or how flexible and dynamic they are, and how their voice works as well. Because if there's no video, voice will be the main medium. So I think these were all things I completely kind of ignored and overlooked as I said, as a professional guest on podcasts.
Yeah, I think just adding on to that, I think my bit would be don't make assumptions about your guests. I think because there are some people who seemed nervous beforehand, hadn't done it before. Maybe when I've seen them around the business school, they're quite quiet. And in front of the microphone, they were just brilliant. They were on it. Like Jana said, that vibe was there. But then vice versa, there are some people I thought would have been, seasoned pros. They've been to all the conferences, they've talked, and they kind of got there and go, well, what do I do now? Also, I think I naively thought that everyone would have listened to the podcast who came on. Like, I always try and do my best. I always explain it. I say with the formats, I say, like with ours, make sure you've got a colleague to do it. I say it's 15 to 20 minutes. You need to ask each other questions. It's informal, etc. And I always try and send them a specific episode that theirs might be most similar to, or they might be interested in. And then I have had quite a few occasions where I'll turn up and someone will say, all right, what questions are you going to ask me then? And I say, no, you know how we had this email trail about how I'm not going to be doing questions and you kind of need to do that homework. And I get it, everyone's busy and everyone's got loads of emails. But I think just don't underestimate that pre-recording stage of thinking what your guest is going to be like, making sure they're aware of what it needs to be like. And just not having those assumptions.
Thanks. And to you, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry about just going blank a minute ago. I would say I totally agree with what Emma's just put in the chat, which is you have to get comfortable with hearing your own voice. That was difficult at the start when you've got to listen to, because you have to realize that as you're editing, you probably listen to every episode maybe 3 or 4 times in the process of kind of getting it all together. So yeah, getting used to your own voice is definitely one thing. Things I wish I'd known before I started, I could have made it a lot simpler. I overcomplicated it. I don't think that's unusual. I started doing really long show notes. I've got quite a complicated, like the way the music and the sound goes together at the start is, you might not know if you listen to it, but it's quite complicated. There was no need for me to do that, and now I'm stuck with it. So that's a bit of a note of caution. But the other thing that I wish I'd known before I started is actually a positive thing. I had no idea how much it would grow my network. And that has been incredible. The people that I've met, the opportunities that it has given me. If I had no idea when I started that that's where it would go. And that's been amazing.
That's a real positive output. So I know we're getting close to the end. So just a couple of minutes and just one question, I think, which kind of fits quite aptly at the end of the process. In terms of how do you try and measure, and this may be one of those jobs that you want to do, and goes back to what Hannah says, it's something you want to do and it's having the time. And I totally get that. I'm sort of like in that same position. But what about measuring impact and obviously making cases for doing these things and potentially using it as a way to generate the funding as well to support? So, you know, we can have two Hannahs instead of one by making those cases, because clearly podcasts are growing in their potential and in their number. So I don't know who wants to pick that up. Maybe you, Hannah, in terms of this.
Yeah, it's really hard, as with any communications, to be honest. It's difficult. I mean, you can have numbers, you can look, blog posts, you can look at your Google Analytics, social media, you can get engagement, podcasts, you look at number of listens, but they can be quite arbitrary. Like, you've got 50, you've got 500, you've got 5,000. Well, are you comparing with someone else? Are you comparing with another season? For me, and to be honest, maybe this is just me saying it's a bit of a safety net to cover ourselves, but I try not to focus on the listeners, the numbers, but try and see if any of our speakers have had some impact from it. So, for example, for one of the episodes, someone shared it with their stakeholders, and the leader of that stakeholder group said how much they appreciated it because the group wasn't very data literate, but to be able to have that episode meant that they could all share it within the organization and people could take it on board more. And for me, that's what it's about. You know, if that episode only had 30 people, but there were 30 people in the organization who then took away, well, that means more to me than 1,000 people listened to it and then instantly forgotten it. So it's kind of an unsatisfactory answer, because really what we all want to go is, oh yeah, you want X amount and you go do this and it increases it, and that will be great, and then your boss will love it, and then you'll get more money to increase it. Unfortunately, I don't have that magical answer, but for me, it's it's impact, isn't it? That keyword. It's, are people implementing your findings? Are they engaging? Are they enjoying? Are they sharing? Are they spreading the word? So I try and avoid setting yourself any limits, saying we're going to launch this podcast and we're going to aim for 500 listeners every month, because you're kind of setting yourself up for fail. It's good to monitor it. It's good to see what's working, and maybe the ones where you have multiple guests on, they perform higher, or maybe you've learned that the ones you release on a Tuesday morning do better than the ones you do on a Friday afternoon. You know, the metrics can help you in that way, but I just try to say not get too caught up with the numbers.
That's a great answer, Hannah. I think some really good points, well made. Thank you. Does anyone have any final comments or anything? Because I know we're at time and Nick will want to wrap up. And for anyone who's asked any questions, I do apologise, we've not covered them at the moment, but I'm sure you can contact any of your colleagues, or if you're from external of Leeds, I'm sure they'll still be happy to hear from you if you've got any burning questions you want to ask. So they'll all be discoverable on the web through various means. So if you've got any burning questions, please do. And I apologise that we've not covered them all, but I think there's been a real good conversation here today, a lot to cover, and it shows there's a lot of potential. Is there any kind of closing points from anyone that they'd like to make?
I think for me, I was, when Ruth suggested it was Ruth's bright idea, I kind of thought she was nuts. I still do think she's nuts in a really, really enjoyable way, but I'm loving it, so just give it a go, and I'm really enjoying speaking to interesting people who were outside my network but are now inside it. So just to kind of, it's been real fun.
Can I just add that one thing that I would advise myself was give your listeners far more time and engagement, because they've taken half an hour from their incredibly busy schedules to listen to your show. Try to engage them afterwards as well.
Brilliant. Anyone else? Final comments? If not, I'll hand over to Nick. I'd like to say thank you all for coming today. I think it's been a fascinating discussion, really a lot of useful information. Hopefully it's inspired some people to maybe take their journey or contact colleagues to actually record their own podcasts. So.
Thanks for listening to the Research Culture Uncovered podcast. Please subscribe so you never miss out on our brand new episodes. And if you're enjoying the discussions, give us some love by dropping a 5-star rating and written review, as it helps other research culturists find us. And please share with a friend and show them how to subscribe. Thanks for listening, and here's to you and your research culture.